Well, hello, good people of the world. It is indeed the Big Heavy, back after a bit of a hiatus, looking a bit more disheveled, and maybe we'll get into that in some other video. But today I want to cover a 1-year review of this guy, the Garmin Descent MK3i. And this sucker has been on my wrist pretty much 24/7 for the last year. I take it off basically just to shower and to charge it up. I've had this sucker on my wrist doing cold plunges, swimming, doing hot tubs, pretty much anything you can imagine. And for me, probably my biggest use, and the reason I've had a Garmin of some sort on my wrist for almost 20 years at this point, is I do a lot of running and ultimately have gotten into endurance running in the past couple of 3 years. I'm training for 100K coming up. I've had a Garmin on my wrist during a 100-mile race, and that's the majority of my focus. But I also love to get out and do some scuba diving with my family. I do, get down to 110, 120 feet on a lot of my diving. I'm nitrox certified, so I do have that nitrox capability that I use pretty often on this watch. Now, I am a self-confessed and certified, or perhaps certifiable, Garmin fanboy. As I mentioned, I've had a Garmin watch of some sort for most of my running and athletic career. This is my first dive watch. Previously, I was mostly a oceanic type of guy. My last dive computer was an oceanic dive watch with the air integration. So first Garmin dive watch, but definitely not my first Garmin. And I did pay for this with my own money. Like every man, I have a price. Mine's pretty low, so I would not turn down free stuff if Garmin wanted to send some my way. But I did buy this, and if you are in a similar market, and we'll talk a little bit about pricing, the short answer is it's painful on these things. There are some discounts out there that are available. In my case, my health insurance provider, if you go on their website, somewhere buried in there is a extra benefits type of page, and they have a link to a Garmin discount code. And I think you can use it, in my case, like a couple or 3 times a year or something like that. It's 20% off. It works for, I think, every device that hasn't come out in the last 90 days. So you can basically get anything that's not brand new. That's how I got my Descent. That's how I got all my little dive pods. There's a few cons I found to this watch after a year of wear as well, and I'll hit on those. I'm not going to go super deep into menus or every single feature and function. There's folks like DC Rainmaker out there that cover that kind of stuff really well. This is more about my personal experience and what I've liked and disliked. So starting with the physical features of the watch after a year of ownership, the watch itself basically looks about the same as the day it came out of the box. Whatever glass they use on there, I think in this case it's a sapphire crystal. No scratches, nothing like that. I haven't babied this watch. It's, again, been on my wrist 24/7. I've been crawling under the RV and doing work on it, running around the woods, tripping over roots and falling on my big old butt occasionally, and who knows what's happened to the watch when I've done that. No scratches whatsoever on the crystal itself. Maybe some very, very minor stuff around the bezel that you'd have to really look to find, but the material they use, and this version has, I believe it's called a diamond-like coating, the DLC. I don't know how it compares to an actual diamond, but it does seem to be really effective in keeping the watch looking nice. The band, and this is the generic Garmin silicone band, looks like a band that's been on somebody's wrist for a year. Still functions fine. It's got some scuffing and rubbing. I generally will get maybe 2.5 years out of a Garmin watch band. And with that quick fit system that they have, it's super easy to pop the bands off, get yourself a new one. You can get a Garmin branded band, which I think are a little bit overpriced, but they seem to last and work well. Or there's dozens, if not hundreds of knockoffs available. Everything from a silicone-like strap to cloth and leather and metal and all sorts of things. Probably the only 2 items of note, and these aren't really negatives, but things that happened to me over the course of wearing this thing for a year. A couple or 3 times I've had stuck buttons, and by that I mean you go to press a button and it physically you can't get it to press, or it'll press and not release, and essentially it's non-functional. This seems to happen if you don't rinse the watch, either after diving and you get some crusty salt water in there, or I sweat rather violently and excessively. So, on a super hot run day, if I don't rinse the watch off afterwards, I may have a stuck button. And the solution to that is pretty simple. Basically, fill up a cup of water, dunk the watch in there, and after an hour or two, that seems to clear it up. These buttons, and I believe on the Fenix 8 as well, are not traditional physical buttons where there's some physical thing that goes and punches a sensor inside the watch. They use magnets, and I don't understand completely how that works, but essentially the actual watch electronics are fully sealed inside the watch. That little magnet thing lets the watch understand that you're pushing a button, and sometimes I guess some funk gets in there. But the solution is pretty simple. The other minor thing of note from a physical perspective is this is a pretty big honkin' watch. The Fenix series is pretty big. People will complain about how heavy and large it is. This guy is even heavier and even larger than the Fenix series. And it took a little bit of getting used to. I have had a Fenix since I think the Fenix 3, so several generations back. The first time I put one on my wrist coming from a Forerunner, which is Garmin's focused running watch, made out of plastic, pretty light and pretty thin. For the first 2 days or so I was wearing the Fenix, I was like, ooh, there's a monster on my wrist. Same thing with this guy. When I went from the Fenix to the Descent, it's probably 10%, maybe a little less than 10% bigger and 10% heavier, but it's noticeable. But then after a couple days, it completely went away for me. And I wear this when I sleep. Some people think I'm crazy for that, but I like getting the sleep metrics and having that incorporated into all my data, and I'm totally used to it. It doesn't bother me at all. So let's talk about all the things that I like about this watch, and then we'll jump into dislikes, and we'll talk a little bit about whether this is the right watch for you. So probably the headliner, and this is true for all of Garmin's watches, is battery life. Garmin are kind of the masters of long battery life in sports watches. And to give you an idea, right now I'm training for a 100K race, and that's got me putting in 50 to 70 miles of running each week, which I'm going at a slow pace because it's an endurance race, maps out to 10 to 15 hours of running time. And that's with all the GPS stuff turned on. More often than not, I'm listening to an audiobook, so that's Bluetooth headphones connected to the watch, the music player's going. My running settings on here are pretty much the Garmin default, so the display is on, it'll get bright if I turn to look at the watch. The GPS, all the GPS systems are on, so I can track my route and all that stuff. Heart rate sensor is on. Sometimes I'll wear a heart rate strap if I'm going on a longer run. And with all that stuff going, I charge once a week on Mondays, and I generally still have 30, sometimes 40 to 50% of battery remaining, despite going out and doing all those runs. If you did none of that stuff and you just wore this as a smartwatch and a watch to go diving every now and then, you pretty easily get a couple or 3 weeks of battery life. I don't think I've done a full 2 or 3 week sit on the couch and veg in quite a while, so I haven't tested that. But if I'm doing light running, if I'm in a recovery week or something like that, where I'm maybe running a couple or 3 miles a day for the week and maybe doing some walking or some cycling or something like that, I can go a good week and a half, 2 weeks without having to charge the watch. Now, the story is a little bit different for scuba diving. I found I could get 2 days or about 6-ish dives before the watch would be getting down to 30, 40%, and I'd want to charge it up on my most recent dive trip down to Bonaire. Generally, I like to start the day with a full charge, so I was pretty religious about charging it every night. But clearly the diving takes a lot more battery life out of the watch. And I would guess that's due to the air integration feature. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. But do be aware, excellent battery life if you're just doing sports stuff. You're going to be charging this probably weekly at the most, unless you're going out and running for 5-6 hours a day. But if you're going on a dive vacation, you do want to bring the charging cable with you. I do like that for the most part, if I'm going on a business trip for anything less than a week, I just leave the charger at home. I'm fine. I don't worry about anything. I have all the notifications turned on. Again, I'm listening to audiobooks or music when I'm running. I have all the sensors turned on, and it's never a problem. But if you were going on a live-aboard dive vacation or a dedicated dive vacation, you definitely want to bring that charger with you. Next thing I love about this watch is Garmin's sports ecosystem. And again, I'm not going to go super deep in here, but if you're primarily a diver and maybe you do a little running on the side, or you're thinking of getting into some sort of exercise routine, Garmin's world class of the sports stuff. I've tracked everything from snowshoeing to stand-up paddleboarding to skiing, both alpine and Nordic. You can basically track any sport worth tracking and get data and metrics that are relevant and helpful to your pursuit of that particular sport. And this watch is basically a Garmin Fenix 7/Epic/Enduro in terms of all the sports it can handle, all the tracking it does, all the metrics. The only difference that you get on the Descent versus the newest sports watch series, which is the Fenix 8, Fenix 8 Pro, their menu system's a little different. They have a slightly updated heart rate sensor, and they've started adding some new smart capabilities. But essentially you have, the latest and greatest of sports capabilities from the Fenix 7 Epic's Enduro. The other thing I like, and this may be a con to some people, is there's just enough smart features. So I would not necessarily call this a smartwatch, particularly compared to something like an Apple Watch or one of the Android watches that are really focused on notifications, phone calls, apps, all that sort of thing. Now, this watch does provide notifications. I have it paired with my Apple iPhone. So if I get a text message, I can look on there and see the text message. I have it set up so certain other notifications come in, and it's essentially view only. Think of it like another screen where you can kind of glance and get info from your smartwatch. You can't respond to text messages. I can't make calls from this. The other smartwatch type capabilities that are on here that I like are that you can listen to music. You can either load your own MP3s or you can connect to Spotify and essentially download a playlist, which I find pretty useful since we already use Spotify. You can also listen to audiobooks, which I like to do on longer runs, although it's a bit challenging to get them loaded on here. If you have an Audible subscription, which I do, you have to go and do some funky stuff to take the DRM off of those files and then load it onto your watch through a slightly convoluted approach. But unfortunately, you can't directly load audiobooks from something like Audible. Spotify now supports limited audiobook functionality. You can't load those onto the watch. You can, however, load podcasts from Spotify, which is a little bit janky. You got to go into the watch, make sure your phone's nearby so it can connect to your phone, pick the podcast you want, and then download them on an individual basis. So not great, but it works. This watch doesn't have any sort of cellular connectivity like an Apple Watch or something like that. Anything connectivity related relies on your phone. To me, that is a little bit of a negative. All things being equal, I would love if this had a cellular modem in it like an Apple Watch. I hate carrying my phone with me on runs. Maybe I'm unusual, but every time I see those people that have like a iPad or tablet strapped to their arm, I think that looks horrible, and the thing's invariably flapping around all over the place. So 99% of the time I'm running not with my phone. And it would be nice, all things considered, if I had the ability to send my location so my wife can figure out where I am. If there's an emergency, folks can get in touch with me. But typically I just sort of throw caution to the wind. The other thing I really like that when it first came out on the Fenix, I thought would be a gimmick and would be sort of dumb and goofy, is the light on here. So let's see. I don't know if you can see that. It's in red light mode, but essentially you tap two buttons and you get a little light on there. There's a red light, there's 5 levels of brightness. Seems super dumb, but I find it wildly useful. So as a man in his 40s, typically I'm getting up at some point in the middle of the night to go and use the facilities. Tappy tappy, I got my red light, so I'm not blinded. I'm not searching around for my phone and then figuring out which of the 300 buttons I have to use to turn the stupid flashlight on. And I can use that to go and migrate to the facilities without tripping over something. If I'm out at night walking the dog, tappy tappy, I get a little light. I can go and see the poo I'm trying to pick up and not get it all over myself, which is always a good feature. And just the dozen random times during the week where you need a flashlight. You're trying to get a key in a lock, trying to find something that you dropped, seeing at night or whatever. This is infinitely more useful than figuring out where your phone is, pulling it out, and it's invariably too bright, and invariably it turns on in my pocket more than it actually turns on in a useful manner. So that light is super useful. And the other neat thing it does is if you activate the feature, it'll do some weird blinky combination while you're running based on how your arms are moving. So it essentially makes a little flashing light so people can see you if you're running in the dark, which is quite neat. And it will automatically turn on if the sun is down and then automatically turn off once you pass the sunrise time. I've tried it diving. The light does work when you're underwater, and it's okay-ish. If you have it on maximum brightness, maybe you can see under a little rock or something and you get 3 or 4 feet of visibility, but obviously not something you would want to rely on as either a primary or a backup dive light. More of a, hey, it's daytime, I want to see under this little ledge and could use a bit of extra light, and it's there and it's easy. So let's talk about the scuba diving capabilities, because clearly if you just wanted neat sports stuff, you wouldn't be listening to a video about the Descent MK3i. And I would say they're solid, but not quite perfect. Probably my biggest complaint about the dive features on the watch are on the sports side, you can configure pretty much everything you want about a particular activity. So if on my run screen, I want to see my pace and the time of day and sunset and my time zone, which is a weird combination of things, I can set that up. And basically any metric that's available on the watch, I can put it on a screen and I can have some things be big, some things be small, some things show up as a little chart, some things just show up as a number. But on the dive side, you're limited to, I think it's 3 or 4 screens. You're limited to the data fields you can show, and you kind of get Garmin thinks you should get versus being able to go in and have that same level of configurability that you have on the sports side. I don't know why that's totally different. It seems bizarre that they don't have the same interface and that same capability as you have on the sports side. I guess maybe they think you should only be able to see certain fields, or there's certain fields that are mission critical that you should have to look at, versus being able to set up the order you want things and what you want big and small. And in terms of the size of the information, again, I'm a mid-40s man and my eyes are rapidly deteriorating, and the numbers are a little bit small on here when you're diving. I have gotten a prescription mask that has like bifocals in the bottom, so I look like a super dork, but I can actually now see my watch and not have to, extend my arm 15 feet in front of me to be able to vaguely make out the numbers. So if you do struggle and need readers on a daily basis, consider something like a prescription mask. This is probably true for any dive watch, unless you get one of those, big honkin' shearwater things that are the size of a small tablet, in which case the numbers might actually be big enough for someone like me to be able to see. Other items of note on the diving side, I do quite like the Garmin Dive app, with the caveat that it's the classic walled garden. And what that means, if you're not familiar with the term, is basically you're in this beautiful garden, but there's a wall around it and you can't go outside of that wall lest you're no longer in the beautiful garden. And in Garmin's case, the dive app's great. As soon as you get out of the water and the watch finds your phone, sends all your dive data over, super cool, looks nice, easy to use, tracks all the things you'd want to track. But it's really difficult to import data into there. So if you've done any diving before, if you're like me and have 100 dives somewhere logged in some other app, there's no easy way to get that into Garmin Dive. I basically just would take 20 minutes and do 10 dives a day and move them over and move the stats I cared about into the Garmin Dive app. And it does have an export feature. I'm not sure how well that will work, but the punchline is once you're in that Garmin Dive app, you're kind of stuck. And thankfully, it's a nice app, does everything I'd expect to do with a few little wrinkles here and there. Some of the other things I like about the diving capabilities, the compass feature is quite nice. It has one of those compasses where you don't have to have the watch perfectly flat. You can kind of have it at an angle and you'll still get the correct bearing. It does have some neat features where you can do a reverse heading, you can do a 90-degree plus or minus heading. That does require you to remember the right combination of buttons to execute that feature, which no matter how often I'm diving, I invariably forget. I also quite like that they do some integration with the rest of the sort of sports and physiological capabilities of the watch. So you get this dive readiness score every day, and it bases that on your sleep. It bases that on some of the other activities you've done. So if I'm going to go out later today and do a 2-hour run, and after that, the watch will tell me, hey, you might want to take it easy when you're diving. Since things like booze or food consumption or staying up late will affect your sleep metrics, that'll also feed into that dive readiness score. And it's not perfect. It's not inside your actual body. It's just doing math based on some of the sensor readings it has. But it's not a bad way to, when you wake up in the morning, I would use this. And if we were planning a dive to like 120 feet or something like that, and my dive readiness score was in the middle or on the lower end of things, maybe instead we go and check out the reef at 80 or 90 just to avoid that risk of decompression sickness or avoid something bad happening. Another neat Garmin tie-in to the rest of the Garmin universe is I got the little case for the inReach, which is their satellite communicator. As I mentioned, I love Garmin and buy all their stupid stuff. And previously I've had this thing primarily for running out in the woods where there's no cell coverage. It's, a little radio looking thing. You can clip it to the back of your running pack. And from the watch, you can send a little message that says, hey, I'm okay. And they make a waterproof case for it for diving. Our last big dive trip where I used this watch pretty extensively was to Bonaire. And if you're not familiar, Bonaire, pretty much everything is shore diving. And the big warning you get when you head down to Bonaire is you get a little pickup truck, you take all your stuff to the beach, you go and do your dive and have a great time. But everyone says, leave your truck unlocked, leave the windows down, don't leave any valuables in there, don't leave phones or whatever. Otherwise, people are going to go and steal them. And this is not a comment on Bonaire, it's just sort of the way things are. But we had heard of a few people having their, the inspectors, so to speak, come and take things from their truck. So we were very cognizant about not bringing phones, not bringing wallets. And since I was doing most of my diving with my son, and we wanted to keep home base and keep my wife informed, have some degree of communications, have some way of calling in the cavalry if one of us got into trouble, I got this little underwater case for the inReach. And I clip it to my BCD. And the reason I'm telling you this elaborate story is because on the Garmin, you can actually talk to the inReach and send those basic messages. And you can send the little, hey, I'm okay, hey, I'm done with my diving. And we would do that for each of our dives. So we'd basically send in a canned message when we started the dive, we'd send a canned message when we got back to the truck. And you can also send arbitrary text messages. And it's not easy. If you were alive in the 90s at the dawn of cell phones, you might remember the little, tapping out the letters, but it still works, and it works reasonably well. And it worked well enough that when we were out diving, if my wife wanted us to pick up breakfast, or she wanted us to meet her somewhere, or there was some sort of change in plans or something like that, we could pretty easily send out a message without having to worry about having a cell phone hidden in the car and potentially get stolen. You also have the added feature, and perhaps this is me reading too many messages about diving disasters, but you can call in the cavalry if for whatever reason you get washed out to sea and are sort of drifting around. So that brings us to what for me is the big differentiator on the MK3i, and that's the I for air integration. The other big differentiator is you get all those technical diving capabilities, you get rebreather capabilities, you get trimix, all that stuff. I'm not a technical diver, I haven't used those. The nitrox stuff is fine, there's nothing wildly noteworthy. But for me, the reason I bought this watch versus a Fenix 8, which has basic diving capabilities, is the air integration. And there's effectively three things that gets you in the Garmin ecosystem. One is pretty standard, and then the other two are a little more interesting. So the standard one, and this is not new, there's tons of watches out there that have air integration, is you get your tank pressure on your watch, you have a little pod that connects to your regulator in the back, and you get your pressure and you get something called airtime remaining. So the watch basically does the math and says, how fast are you breathing? How deep are we? At what rate are you consuming gas? And it gives you an estimate of how much time you have left until you breathe yourself down to your reserve pressure. So what I like about that is the watch basically does the math and figures out what is limiting your remaining dive time. Typically, that's one of two things. It could be your no decompression time limit, which is essentially how long you have until you have to start worrying about decompression, which is how long you have until you have to start worrying about taking a decompression stop. Not something you want to do for a typical recreational diver. Or it will also do the math and say, how fast are you breathing? It'll essentially tell you, here's how much time you have remaining in your dive. Now, of course, as a good and responsible diver, you've done some dive planning, you've talked to your buddy, you said, here's the depth we're going to go to, here's our maximum time, and of course you have backups and you've mapped all that out. But being able to just look at there and at a glance have it tell you, here's what's going on, is a nice feature. And again, that's not unique to Garmin. Every other air integrated computer on the market does that as far as I know. What is interesting and unique about Garmin is you also can communicate with the other divers in your group, assuming they have that tank pod. And even if they don't have a Garmin watch, as long as they have that tank pod and it's configured and on your watch, you've essentially paired yourself with those other pods, you can see all your dive buddies' tank pressures as well. Now, as a responsible diver, it's everyone's responsibility to be aware of their tank pressures. one of the first things you learn when you're diving is to go up to people and say, hey, what's your pressure? And then, they do a little signal, which everyone seems to do differently, and is probably worth discussing if you've got a new dive buddy. But it is nice, it is convenient, and I think it is an extra margin of safety, particularly if you're diving with more than one person, to be able to look on there and say, my son's running a little low, he burns air faster than my wife and I do, and see everyone's pressure. When I'm diving with the family, we still practice the, hey, what's your pressure? But it's great to be able to look on here and see my pressure, my wife's pressure, my son's pressures, and just have a good idea where everyone is. The other feature that's unique to Garmin, and is something I actually thought I would enjoy and use and find a lot more useful than I have in practice, is there's a messaging capability that goes along with that air integration feature. And you're not sending arbitrary text messages, you're not sending LOL and emojis and all that sort of thing. You basically can pick from a list of, I think it's up to maybe 15 messages. You can select the ones that are kind of your top 4 or 5 or so. And it's everything from, are you okay, to look over here, to where are you? And essentially all the basic things you would normally do with hand signals. I thought this would be super cool and super useful, and it works reasonably well. I think my one complaint from a pure functionality perspective, takes you a couple seconds to find the right message, and then it takes maybe 5 or 6 seconds for that to get sent and show up on the other person's wrist. That doesn't seem like a huge deal. Maybe it's 10, 12 seconds, all things added together. But if I see something cool and want to say, hey, look over here, there's a really interesting eel or whatever, finding a metal clip and then banging it on my tank and getting everyone's attention and saying, hey, look over here, is probably faster than, seeing the cool thing, looking at my watch, getting to the right menu, finding the message that says, hey, look over here, hitting the send button. Then their watch beeps and buzzes. They look and say, oh, he wants me to look over here. That's 20-ish seconds. Whatever the cool thing is, if it's a living cool thing, has probably long since disappeared. Where I did find the messaging relatively useful was typically when we were diving with both my wife and my son. So we were essentially a 3-person dive team. We all would stay pretty close together. But if you're on a reef is over here, the open ocean's over here, and you're all either in a 1, 2, 3 single file line, or you're sort of 3 side by side and folks are staggered, or sometimes we go sort of 3 on top of each other. So we could still, grab somebody if we had a air emergency or needed something. But to get all 3 to sort of stop and do some hand signals and figure things out, it was in that case easier to do things like send a, hey, it's time to turn around, or it's time to start working our way back, or something like that. So the feature does definitely have some utility, but I thought I'd be using it a couple or 3 times a dive. I ended up using it maybe once every couple or 3 dives. I will say I saw some complaints about people being able to hear the transmitter. It uses some form of sonar, and some people have complained, my whole dive, I'm hearing this weird chirping noise and starting to lose my marbles. I didn't hear it, my wife didn't hear it, my son didn't hear it. So maybe we all have bad hearing. Maybe certain people are more sensitive to that than other people. I have heard the newer version of the tank pods is a little bit better in that regard, and they have done some software updates. So it's either fixed, or maybe you have to be particularly attuned to certain frequencies to be able to hear that. But that is something to be aware of, maybe something to check before you go and buy 14 of these sensors. So what are the things I dislike about the MK3i after a year of ownership? So the first thing that I disliked immediately was Garmin's stuff is getting more and more expensive. It generally works really well, it's built really well. The thing, again, looks like it essentially came out of the box the other day. It's hard to totally fault the fact that it's priced at a premium level, but particularly with the MK3i, if you're going to do the air integration, which I don't know why you'd buy the i model if you weren't interested in that, you're in a fair chunk of change for the watch. You're in a fair chunk of change for the air integration pod. All the gurus say you shouldn't screw it directly into your first stage because people are going to use it as a handle and jack up your first stage. So you're in another $40-50 for a special short hose. And to me, the biggest benefit of that air integration feature, aside from just the normal, hey, I can see airtime remaining, is the ability to see other people in your group's tanks and be able to send those messages should you need to. So if you've got a family of 5 and ultimately 5 divers, this is the price of a motorcycle or 5 acres of land in DeLucaville. Some of the other random things I don't love is there's a special charger for this watch versus the regular Garmin ecosystem. You know, if everyone in your family has a Garmin running watch and you're the only person with a Descent, you've now got this big honky clampy looking charger thing. The other thing I don't like is one of the pros of Garmin in the past historically was high cost of entry, but then, you know, no subscriptions, no buying add-ons, no BS. You kind of got everything, you got the best of Garmin, and that was the price of entry. Garmin, like every company, now probably has some nitwit management consultants that told them they need a recurring revenue stream. So there's a Garmin Connect Plus subscription that you pay for. As far as I can tell, there's nothing that Connect Plus does for the Descent system. You get all the dive features, you get everything I talked about. You essentially get everything you've always historically gotten for the price of admission. The only things I've seen that Connect Plus adds is it seems to add some new coaching features. It adds some new little goofy members only badges you can get. I think essentially Garmin is trying to compete with Strava, which if you're not familiar is sort of social media for athlete nerds. I think it's a dumb move. I don't like having another subscription option out there. I haven't seen anything compelling with Connect Plus. Additional badges and a sort of knockoff half-assed Strava competitor, not so interesting. So I don't love that Garmin seems to be dabbling and potentially going deeper into that subscription rabbit hole. The other thing I don't love, and this has been a historical challenge for Garmin, is their software is great until it isn't. So Garmin will have these weird, random, show-stopping kind of bugs. They don't make any sense. They're really hard to replicate. The positive flip side of that is they've been really good about replacing hardware. I have had a few hardware problems, not with this Descent, but with other Garmin watches. And they've always been great about replacing the watch. The replacements invariably address the problem. But to give you some examples, there was this relatively infamous Garmin blue triangle of death loop that happened maybe 7-8 months ago, where Garmin pushed out some kind of update to, I believe, the satellite or time zone settings. And they pushed it out for a couple hours before they realized their mistake and pulled it back. But what would happen is as soon as you start an activity, the watch would reboot, it would show its little Garmin blue triangle, and then it would immediately reboot again. And it was just stuck in this endless reboot loop. Went to go for a run, and watch goes into a reboot of death loop, which is very frustrating since Garmin does track all these metrics that relies on having a pretty extensive run history. And, you know, if I was going out for a 2-hour run and couldn't record it, theoretically it'd throw off my metrics. That's kind of an endurance sport nerd problem, but you pay premium money for a premium product. You don't want the thing to not work when you need it. And Garmin did come out with a fix for that problem on the same day, but it was really quite janky. You had to connect the watch to your computer. You had to hold a whole series of buttons. If you didn't do the timing and the button holding sequence exactly perfectly, you'd have to start all over again. And you know, it was a good couple hours for me to get that sequence exactly right, get the thing fixed, get it working again. And just sort of an example where I think Garmin is not always great on the software front. And on that note, you know, there's essentially a Garmin way of doing things that's not always intuitive. It's relatively consistent. So once you figure out how to get to the menu, how to change settings, where certain settings live, it's consistent and it's pretty straightforward, but there is a learning curve. These things aren't as intuitive as Apple products or something like that. So should you buy the Descent MK3i? And let me run through some other options that you may be considering. So first one is the Garmin Fenix 8. There's now a Pro model, latest and greatest, has basic diving features, doesn't include all the tech stuff, doesn't include air integration. What you do get with the Fenix 8, aside from the owning the latest and greatest, you get a little better heart rate sensor, and you get some new menus and some new capabilities. If I were a betting man, I would say Garmin is probably going to invest in that Fenix 8 software ecosystem more than they're going to invest in some of the historic software like what's on the MK3i. So if you absolutely have to have the latest and greatest and you go diving a couple or 3 times a year and you don't care about tech stuff, you don't care about air integration, I would go with the Fenix 8. The 8 versus the 8 Pro and some of the new cellular connectivity options that they have, that's probably another story. I have some thoughts on that, but not enough to guide you one way or the other, but that's kind of the break point I would go for there. If that air integration stuff is interesting to you, Descent MK3i essentially gets you all the same sports capabilities without the fancy new menus. It's tried and true, works great, and you get the benefit of the enhanced SCUBA functionality. The other thing you might be looking at is the Apple Watch Ultra. My understanding is that does have SCUBA capabilities, but you have to pay extra for an Oceanic app. It is a subscription app. Again, my understanding, I haven't actually played with an Apple Watch, and I have heard of some people going to do their big annual dive trip. They go to fire that puppy up and it's like, hey, your subscription's expired, or it needs to phone the mothership to authorize itself, and you're on a boat in wherever, and it can't do that, and your fancy dive watch is dead. Now you do trade that for getting extensive smartwatch capability. The thing essentially is a tiny little smartphone on your wrist, so you can leave your phone at home, you can go out, you can call people, you can receive calls, you can have emergency tracking. These are things that, all things being equal, I would like to have in a watch. You can get all sorts of apps and do all sorts of neat things. I believe they have a Audible app, so you don't have to worry about all the goofy nonsense to get books on your watch like you do on a Garmin. But your big trade-off is battery life. I don't know that an Apple Watch will last for a full ultramarathon. I don't know that it'll run with GPS and music and all that jazz for something like a 24-hour race. If you're a normal human, you might not care about that stuff. That's something that's important to me. So to me, that's the big trade-off of the Apple ecosystem versus Garmin is super duper smartwatch capabilities, bad battery life, far less smartwatch stuff, a lot more sports focused. Everything works out of the box and it'll run through a 24-hour race. And then your final option, of course, is get whatever fitness watch floats your boat and then get a dedicated dive watch. Shearwater seems to be the standard that a lot of the tech divers use. You can get something that's a big old square thing that goes on your wrist, so you get big numbers and can kind of see things if you've got aging eyes, maybe without that dorky bifocal mask that I now own. But you lose that capability of looking at your overall fitness and having that dive readiness score, which maybe is a gimmick, but I think is kind of nice. And you also have to bring another giant thing with you and remember to have that charge, remember to have it on your wrist. I do kind of like having all the stuff I need in one device that's always on my wrist, and not having to go on vacation and bring two watches or potentially forget one, leave it on the charger or something like that. I'm typically pretty good about always having this thing on my wrist, and if I don't, the one day a week where I charge it, if I leave the house or something, I very quickly notice, oh, that giant hunk of metal is not on my wrist, and I remember to go and get that. So hopefully that helps you make a decision if you're in the market for this watch or considering it. I've been very happy, other than the nuances and the complaints that I've mentioned. If you've got comments or questions, feel free to drop them down below. And hopefully I see you out there on the trails, on the slopes, in the snow, in the rain, in Spain, on a plane, or underwater somewhere. And wish you well in whatever endeavors you embark on. Big Heavy, wishing you peace.